The Messerschmitt was dying. Hans-Werner Lurch could feel it in the way the control stick fought against his grip, in black smoke that poured through the shattered canopy, choking him with the acrid stench of burning oil and hydraulic fluid. American fighters circled above like vultures, their job already done. He was 26 years old, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced
test pilots, and in approximately 90 seconds he would be in American hands. That thought terrified him more than the crash.
For 4 years, Goebbels' propaganda machine had filled every German mind with nightmares about American captivity.
And guards beat you senseless for speaking German. Hans had heard the stories in pilot briefings, in the mess halls, whispered between flights.
The Americans murdered German pilots on sight, especially test pilots who knew too many secrets.
The Reich produced. He was valuable, which meant he was certain that he was wrong.
And what happened in the next 60 seconds would change not just his life, but his understanding of what it meant to have honor. March 1945. The Bavarian countryside rushed up at him through a haze of pain and smoke. Hans grabbed the canopy release with his left hand, his right fumbling with the harness clasp. The metal was slick with his own blood. Warm blood soaking through his flight suit. 1,000 feet. Time to jump or die trying. He pulled the release. The canopy tore away.
Just rested his...
Into the void. The parachute snapped open, jerking him so hard he gasped in pain. Below, his Messerschmitt augured into a farmer's field.
Monsieur. In a shower of earth and twisted metal. 4 years of test flying. Hundreds of hours drifting down into enemy fans with nothing but the knowledge in his head. Knowledge the Americans would torture out of him.
He could see them now. Soldiers running across the field toward his landing spot. Rifles raised. Jeeps bouncing along dirt roads. Kicking up dust. They'd be on him in seconds. This was how it ended. Everything his superiors had warned him about was about to come.
True.
Hans hit the ground hard, his injured shoulder exploding in white-hot pain.
Gasping. His parachute dragged him several meters across the muddy field before he managed to slap the quick release with his good hand. The silk deflated like a surrender flag. He lay there for a moment, trying to breathe through the pain. Above him, the sky was impossibly blue, peaceful, indifferent to the war being fought beneath it. He could hear boots pounding closer, American voices shouting words he could not quite.
He raised his right hand slowly, palm open. The universal gesture of surrender he'd practiced.
Make out over the ringing in his ears. This was it. The moment every German pilot dreaded. Hans forced himself to his knees.
Then to his feet, swaying. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the spring grass.
Use. The American soldiers emerged from the tree line. 5 or 6 of them. United States Army infantry. Rifles trained on his chest.
They were younger than he expected. Farm boys, mostly, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion.
Him. His uniform was shouting something, probably ordering him not to move. Hans' legs trembled beneath him.
With his eyes that he wasn't a threat, that he was wounded, that he just wanted to survive the next 6 seconds. His mouth was too
dry to speak. Even if he could find words, his English was terrible, just technical aviation terms and little else. The sergeant approached cautiously, rifle leveled at Hans's head. Hans could see the man's finger on the trigger, see the calculation in his eyes. Another soldier circled behind him.
Hans felt hands patting him down roughly, checking for weapons. They found nothing, just his blood-soaked flight suit and the iron cross pinned to his chest.
Which one soldier ripped off and pocketed without ceremony. Luftwaffe, the sergeant said, looking at Hans's wings insignia, then louder to his men.
We got ourselves a Krautpilot pilot.
The words died in his throat. The world tilted at odd angles.
Of his face, the way Hans swayed on his feet like a tree about to fall. Hans saw something shift in the American's expression.
Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. One soldier seeing another soldier in trouble. Then the sergeant did something.
Get the medic! The sergeant called over his shoulder, his voice sharp with urgency. This one's hurt bad. A younger soldier, barely 20.
With red hair and freckles that made him look even younger, ran up with a canvas bag marked with a red cross. He dropped to one knee beside Hans, easing him down to sit in the grass with surprising gentleness. Hans wanted to protest, to explain he could stand.
Hate him! He was already cutting away Hans's flight jacket with scissors, exposing the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Damn, you got chewed up.
Pretty good. Hans flinched as the medic probed the wound, but the American's touch was careful, almost tender. Nothing like what he'd expected.
Where was the brutality? The interrogation? The rifle butt to his face? The revenge for all those American pilots shot?
The sergeant. Give it to him. He's no good to intel if he bleeds out. Hans felt the sting of a needle in his thigh. And within seconds, the pain began to recede into a warm, distant fog. The medic was wrapping his shoulder now.
Even though Hans couldn't understand most of the words, but the tone was like talking to an injured friend, not an enemy.
You're gonna be okay, Fritz. We'll get you patched up. The sergeant lit a cigarette, an American Lucky Strike, and to Hans's to him. Hans took it with a shaking hand, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. It tasted like real tobacco instead of the ersatz. Garbage they'd been smoking in Germany for 2 years. Actual tobacco. The sergeant even held his lighter for him, cupping his hand against the spring breeze.
Like they were comrades sharing a break. What's your name, Kraut? The sergeant asked slowly, as if talking to a child. Lurch, Hans managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Hans Werner Lurch. Well, Lurch, you picked a hell of a day to fall out of the sky. War's almost over anyway.
You're lucky you ran into us instead of some of the boys who lost friends to your Luftwaffe. They might not have been so
Friendly. Hans understood maybe half of that, but he caught the essential message. He was lucky.
And instead, an American medic was bandaging his wounds, and a sergeant was sharing cigarettes like they were fellow soldiers instead of enemies.
Nothing about this made sense. Medic says we gotta get him to the aid station. One of the soldiers called out. Load him in.
The jeep, the sergeant replied, already moving on to other concerns, treating Hans's capture as routine business rather than a moment for revenge. As they carried him across the field on a stretcher, Hans looked back at the burning wreckage of his Messerschmitt. 4 years of war condensed into twisted metal and smoke. He'd survived dozens of test flights in experimental aircraft, dodged British Spitfires and American Thunder. Was a blur of morphine and confusion. Hans drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation in English he couldn't follow, seeing flashes of devastated German.
Countryside rolling past, bombed out buildings, burned tanks, the detritus of a lost war. At some point, someone gave him water, held the canteen to his lips like he was a child. Another impossible kindness. When he coughed and some spilled down his chin, the soldier just wiped it away and tilted.
The canteen more carefully. Easy does it, Captain. Small sips.
This was not Fronz. This was not the American brutality he'd been
Warned about since 1941. This was something else entirely.
On a concrete floor, not a pile of straw in some barn. An actual bed with clean white sheets that smelled of soap. His shoulder had been properly bandaged, the pain reduced to a dull, manageable ache. Sunlight streamed.
Like the nightmare scenarios he'd imagined during the long years of war. The room was clean, organized, staffed by
Other wounded soldiers occupied nearby beds, some American, some German, lying side by side. Nobody
were receiving the same care. A nurse noticed he was awake. A woman in an American Army uniform with captain's bars on her collar. She approached with
her clipboard and a professional smile that seemed genuine rather than forced.
Guten Morgen, Captain Morrison.
How is the pain this morning?
Hans struggled to sit up, his mind still foggy.
You speak German?
A little, enough to check on our patients. She examined his dressings with practiced hands, her touch professional but gentle. You were lucky. Of your arm once it heals.
6 weeks, maybe 8.
I don't understand, Hans said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Why are you treating?
Me? I am your enemy. Captain Morrison gave him a puzzled look, as if the question itself was strange. Because you're wounded. That's what we
do. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. As if there was no other possible response to a wounded. human being. Over the next 3 days, Hans's confusion only deepened. The Americans fed him the same rations they gave their own wounded, not bread.
And water, but hot meals with actual meat, vegetables, coffee with real cream, even chocolate bars. When he mentioned he was still hungry after one meal, they brought
him more food without hesitation, without using it as leverage or demanding information in exchange. The medical care was meticulous. A surgeon came by daily
to check his wound, changing dressings, watching for infection with the kind of careful attention Hans hadn't seen in German hospitals.
Drug the Germans had heard about but rarely had access to. Pain medication came regularly, on schedule, not withheld as punishment or leverage. But the biggest
shock was how the American staff treated him. Not as an enemy, not even as a prisoner exactly, but as a patient who deserved care. His comfort. Would he like another blanket? Was the light too bright? Did he need help getting to the latrine?
Shame or cruelty or mockery. One young private, a kid from Iowa named Miller with an open, friendly face, even tried to teach him English.
phrases during his rounds, laughing good-naturedly at Hans's terrible pronunciation. No, no, Miller would say, grinning. It's thank you, not sank you. You gotta make the sound. See? He'd stick his tongue between his teeth to demonstrate, looking ridiculous but patient. Hans tried it, failed miserably, and Miller just laughed. And patted his good shoulder. We'll work on it, Captain. You've got time. War's almost over anyway.
Lost friends to German fighters, had every reason to hate Luftwaffe pilots, yet here he was treating Hans like a comrade instead of a murderer. Where was the hatred?
The desire for revenge? The anger at what Germany had done? On his fourth day in the hospital, a United States Army Air Force officer arrived.
A major named Patterson, maybe 40, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Like someone who had all the time in the world. He opened a folder filled with papers. "Captain Lurch," he said in perfect, unaccented German.
I understand you're a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Quite an experienced one from what we've gathered.
The threats, the moment when the mask of kindness would fall away. Yes, sir, he said carefully. I was assigned to the Erprobungsstellen, the test centers. Patterson nodded, studying the papers. The Reich's aircraft evaluation facilities. Hans knew he had to be careful. I flew many aircraft types, sir. It was my assignment. I'm sure you did. Patterson leaned back, his tone
conversational rather than accusatory, like they were two colleagues discussing work.
The question now isn't who wins. We know that answer. The question is what happens next? What happens to men like you? Hans said nothing. Waiting for the trap he was certain was coming. We've captured a lot of your aircraft, Patterson continued, almost casual.
Need someone who understands these aircraft to help us evaluate them properly. Someone with real experience, not just technical manuals and guesswork. Hans stared at him,
not quite believing what he was hearing.
You want me to help you?
I want you to do what you've always done. Fly and evaluate aircraft, except now.
You'd be doing it for us instead of the Luftwaffe. Patterson smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The alternative is sitting in a POW camp. Until the war officially ends, then getting shipped home to whatever's left of Germany. Your choice. It wasn't really a choice.
The offer itself. The Americans were not torturing him. They were proposing a job. They were acknowledging his expertise. Why would you trust me? Hans asked genuinely.
Confused. Who said anything about trust? Patterson's smile widened. You'll be watched. Armed guards...
Hans thought about it for 3 seconds. He thought about Hildegard and his daughter, thought about the ruins of Germany, then thought about what he loved.
Most flying. The Americans were offering him a chance to keep doing what he was born to do. "I will help you," he said quietly. Patterson stood and offered his hand. Hans shook it, feeling the surreal nature of the moment. A Luftwaffe...
As colleagues, welcome aboard, Captain, Patterson said. Let's get that shoulder healed up. We've got a lot of aircraft for you to evaluate. The Americans moved Hans
to a more secure facility near Frankfurt within a week. But secure turned out to mean something very different than imagined.
But his quarters were comfortable, the food remained good, and the Americans treated him with consistent professional respect that never wavered.
A pragmatist who had flown P-47 Thunderbolts in combat over France. He invited Hans to dinner his first night at the Newfoundland. Questions about Luftwaffe training methods. Not interrogation, genuine professional curiosity.
Us hell for years. I lost 2 wingmen to BF-109s over France in '44. Good men. What made your training program so effective in the early years?
Hans hesitated. unsure if this was a trap, a trick to make him reveal secrets.
Talking to another about the craft they both understood. We had time, Hans said carefully, still tests. In days, sometimes hours. Raymond nodded grimly, his expression darkening.
He poured Hans a glass of wine, actual wine, not the rotgut that had been available in Germany for years.
Here's to the poor bastards.
Who didn't make it? Ours and yours. They drank to the dead. Hans felt tears prick his eyes.
Lost friends to German guns, had every reason to hate him, yet here he sat sharing wine with a Luftwaffe pilot, acknowledging the common humanity of
loss. Over the following weeks, Hans met the team he would be working with. American test pilots, engineers, intelligence officers. But as they worked together, examining captured German aircraft, discussing design philosophies and performance characteristics, something
to the fabled pilot who had shot either one fighters of the 30th Cloud one Mises over the Rhine.
Of different armaments and engine configurations. Their conversations started stiffly, professionally distant, but soon became animated. The passion of men who understood what it meant to trust your life to a machine at 20,000 feet. Your 109 turns better than my Mustang at low altitude. Larson admitted one afternoon as they examined a captured Gustav model in the hangar. But above 20,000 feet, we owned you. You couldn't touch us up.
There. The supercharger, Hans agreed, running his hand along the 109's wing. We never solved that problem properly, and your range, my God, you could fly to Berlin.
And back, we would run out of fuel after an hour of combat. Larson grinned. That's what happens when you've got Packard Merlin engines and drop
tanks. Though I'll admit, first time I saw an ME-262 jet scream past me, I nearly missed myself. You bastards in your jets almost changed everything.
The casual profanity, the easy come around impossible. They should hate each other instead of swapping pilot stories.
In the shared experience of combat flying, the real breakthrough came when Hans first flew a captured P-51 Mustang.
And they asked Hans to put it through its paces. Standing beside the aircraft, this beautiful American fighter that had
Hans felt a complex mix of emotions churning in his chest. Respect for the machine's elegant design.
The pilot's pure childlike desire to fly something new. She's all yours, Captain, Major Patterson said, gesturing to the cockpit like a man offering a gift.
So different in size after all. The instruments were logically arranged, easier to read than the cramped German equivalents. He went through the pre-flight checklist with
football. An American engineer translating when necessary, patient as Hans asked questions. Then he fired up the Packard Merlin engine.
Through the airframe, thrumming in his chest. German engines had their own music, their own character, but this was something else entirely. This was American industrial might.
Condensed into 12 cylinders of raw power. Hans taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and opened the throttle.
From the gate, the acceleration was brutal, pinning him back in his seat harder than any German fighter ever had. He was airborne in seconds.
Climbing at a rate that made him laugh out loud despite himself, despite everything. Good God, this thing could climb.
Forgot his wounded shoulder, forgot being a prisoner. He just flew. He pushed the Mustang through every maneuver he knew. Loops.
That pulled G-forces until his vision tunneled. He tested the stall characteristics, the control response, the incredible visibility from the bubble canopy.
Cockpit. He even attempted some combat maneuvers, imagining how he would have fought against his former comrades in this machine.
What they'd been up against. This was why Germany lost the air war. When he landed, Patterson and Larson were waiting on the tarmac, eager for his assessment.
Well, Patterson asked, what do you think? Hans climbed out of the cockpit, his face flushed with the pure joy of flight. His conic pride in life. It is a beautiful machine, he said honestly. Superior to the BF-109 in almost every measurable way. Remarkable, truly remarkable engineering.
What about weaknesses? Larson pressed curiously. Every aircraft has them.
Thoughtfully, and the ammunition load is lighter than I'd prefer for ground attack missions, but as a pure fighter, as an air superiority platform, he shook his head admiringly.
In the hands of a good pilot, it is devastating. We knew this, of course. We felt it every day in the sky, but actually flying one. He paused, searching for words in his limited English. Now I understand why we lost.
To fly their finest fighter, and he had responded with unvarnished truth. instead of pride.
Helping his captors. He was a test pilot doing what test pilots do, evaluating aircraft objectively without national bias.
Down even further, Larson produced a photo of his girlfriend back in Michigan, showing it around with obvious pride. Sarah, he said softly, we're getting married when?
If I get home on time, she's already threatening to start without me. The other pilots laughed. Another pilot, Lieutenant Morrison, pulled out pictures of his two kids. Jenny's 7 now, Tommy's 5. Haven't seen him in 18 months. They probably won't even recognize me. Hans felt in his flight suit pocket they had.
Returned his personal effects after initial processing and pulled out his own creased photograph. Hildegard holding their...
Like another lifetime.
My family, he said simply, his voice thick. The Americans passed it around the table, looking at the photo with the same tenderness they
had shown their own. No sneers, no mockery, no jokes about the enemy, just men recognizing that the enemy pilot also had people waiting for him. Beautiful wife.
Morrison said quietly, your daughter looks just like her. She is 3, Hans said, struggling with the English words. She will not remember me.
If I'm gone too long. You'll get back to them, Larson said firmly. War's almost done. They're already processing prisoners for repatriation. You'll be home before you know.
Telling her stories about the crazy Americans you met. Hans wanted to believe that with every fiber of his being, but more than the promise of
home. What struck him most was the compassion in these men's voices. They were not guards and prisoner, not victors and vanquished.
Understanding each other's fears and hopes across the divide of nationality.
That the propaganda had been lies. The Americans were not monsters. They were professionals who took their jobs seriously but never forgot.
Have been easier not to. They showed respect to an enemy pilot who had helped kill their friends, not because they were weak, but because they believed.
In something larger than revenge. This was not mercy born of weakness. This was conviction, strength.
A wounded enemy deserved care, that a prisoner deserved food, that a test pilot deserved the chance to keep flying.
The possibility that there was a better way to be human. And Hans Werner Lurch, shot down over the run.
Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. Hans heard the news in the officers' mess at the base near Frankfurt.
And wept with relief. They had survived, the war in Europe was over. Hans sat quietly at his table.
His nation lay in ruins. Everything he'd fought for had been for nothing, or worse than nothing. The atrocities, the systematic murder that had been happening while he flew his test missions. But his work with
restrictions eased. Hans evaluated dozens of captured German aircraft over the following months. Not just fighters, but experimental designs, rocket planes, and jets that had never...
Entered production. His reports were detailed, honest, and invaluable to American engineers.
Hans provided context. He explained the design philosophies, the resource constraints, the desperate gambles taken,
and which were propaganda fantasies, last-ditch hopes with no basis in reality. Then in August, just 3 months after...
That seemed impossible. Captain Lurch, Patterson said, sitting across from him in a private office, we've been impressed with your work, very impressed. The Navy's test pilot.
Program has authorized me to offer you a position.
Hans looked at him blankly.
A position? From POW status immediately, granted special immigration status, and allowed to bring your family to the United States.
We need your expertise as we develop our own jet program. You'd be working alongside our test pilots, evaluating both German and
aviation for the next decade. Hans stared at the papers, unable to process what was being offered. You want me to come to America? To stay?
We want
you to keep doing what you do best. Fly and evaluate aircraft. The only difference is you'll be doing it in America, with American citizenship as a possibility. Down the line, with your family safe and provided for. Patterson leaned back. I won't lie to you, there will be Germans who see this as betrayal.
But Germany is going to be occupied and divided for years. Your aviation industry is being dismantled. There won't be any test flying jobs for German pilots for a very...
To Hildegard, explaining the offer as best he could in censored letters. Her response came 2 weeks later.
Won't remember your face. If the Americans will take us, we should go.
The papers. The Americans flew Hildegard and his daughter to the United States in early 1947. The first time he'd seen them in nearly 2 years.
2 years of letters and photographs and hoping, but no touch, no certainty.
In American clothes who claimed to be her father. She'd been 3 when he left. He'd missed her 4th birthday, her first day of school, 2 years.
Of her life he could never get back. But Hildegard threw her arms around him and wept.
From somewhere deep, from the fear and uncertainty and impossible hope of the past 2 years.
I didn't know if I would ever see you again, she whispered in German against his chest.
Voice breaking.
We're here. We made it.
Eventually his daughter came to him, slowly at first, testing
Him, Papa. Hans picked her up, feeling how much she'd grown, how much he'd missed, and made a silent promise.
Near Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. The Navy provided housing, a small house and a...
To bombed-out Germany, it was paradise. Running water, electricity, stores with
of jet fighters that would serve in Korea and beyond. His colleagues were former enemies, American pilots who had fought. They had their children over for dinner. They celebrated holidays together. They formed the kind of bonds only survivors been wary of working with a former Luftwaffe ace, stood as godfather to Hans's 2nd child, born in America in 1949. Short speech Hans would never forget. We were enemies for 4 years, Larson said, holding the baby with the awkward.
We fought each other in the skies over Europe. We tried to kill each other. That's just the truth of it. But we've been friends for 4 years.
now, and I hope we'll be friends for 40 more. I think that says something important about doing things the right way, even in war, especially.
In war. The room was quiet after that. Americans and Germans both processing the weight of those words.
Broke the silence by asking loudly when they could eat cake, and everyone laughed. The moment passed, but Hans never forgot it. He thought often of Larsen's
words. Doing things the right way, even in war, especially in war.
Hans Werner Luhr. He'd flown over 150 different aircraft types for 3 air forces, the Luftwaffe, the United States Navy, and later
to the development of jet fighters, carrier operations, and early supersonic flight research. The boy from
bridge between eras and nations, between enemies and allies, between war and peace.
The family tradition. His grandchildren would be purely American, with only stories and old photographs connecting them to Germany and the...
Made sure they knew those stories. He made sure they understood why they mattered. Your grandfather was treated well because Americans believe in certain principles, he would tell them.
Even in war, even with enemies who had done terrible things, there are rules. There is dignity.
Perfect, but that they try to live up to their ideals even when it's difficult. In 1985, a military historian...
Pilots. Near the end, she asked what he'd learned from fighting for Germany and then working for America. Hans was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. At 76, his face was lined with age, his hair white, but his eyes were still sharp.
Life pushing machines and himself to their limits. I learned that the values a nation claims to hold are tested not in how it treats its friends,
but in how it treats its enemies, he said finally. Germany claimed to be superior, claimed to represent
our own people with brutality. America claimed to believe in human dignity and rule of law.
Inconvenient.
He paused, then continued softly. I also learned that showing mercy is not the same as being weak.
Won the most destructive war in history. They were strong enough to win, but also disciplined enough to follow their own rules about how prisoners should be treated.
That is real strength. That is the kind of strength that builds something lasting. The interviewer pressed.
Of the war? Hans didn't hesitate.
Absolutely.
Pilots knew they would receive medical care instead of execution. They were less likely to fight to the death. American humanity was a weapon, not in a
cynical way, but in a very practical way. It saved American lives by encouraging Germans to give up. He leaned forward, emphasizing...
America offered us a future instead of revenge. That memory shaped post-war Germany more than
It won the peace. Germany became America's ally because Germans remembered how we were treated. We remembered the medical care, the food, the respect. We remembered that.
84, surrounded by family in his Maryland home. His obituary appeared in aviation magazines around a bridge between former enemies. At his funeral, several elderly American pilots attended.
They stood with Hans' American children and grandchildren. 3 generations who existed because one American sergeant.
Larson, now in his 80s himself, spoke at the service. Hans used to say he got shot down over the...
Strong despite his age. He meant it literally that day in March 1945 when his Messersmid went down and he parachuted into that field, but he also
meant it figuratively. We gave him a chance to become American, not just in citizenship, but in spirit.
Looking at the flag-draped casket, that's what made us win the peace, not just the war. We didn't destroy our enemies, we transformed them into allies.
Hans was living proof that it works, that doing the right thing even when it's hard, even when revenge would
Hans Werner Lurch expected to die, bailing out over enemy territory, wounded and terrified. He found humanity in the most unexpected place. A sergeant who lowered his rifle and called for help. A medic who bandaged
his expertise and offered him purpose instead of punishment. Pilots who became colleagues, then friends, then family. Hans lived 58 more years after that moment. He raised actions.
When mercy is seen as strength, not weakness. He never forgot the moment that Sergeant lowered his rifle.
Even when enemies did not. It was a conscious choice to win the peace by transforming rather than destroying.
Kept peace in Europe for generations. Do you have a family story of World War II, of prisoners of war?
In 1945, he found humanity instead. And in that humanity, he found a future for himself, for his family.
Of enemies who became friends. Of small acts of kindness that changed everything.
The darkest times. Next week, we'll share another untold story from World War II. Subscribe so you don't miss it.